Hello everyone, this is class number 4 of nuk309, and today, as I promised you, we're going to start working on the balcony shot, and this is going to take us through the majority of the course. So without further introductory words, let's just get started. So plate in here, starting at frame 1, we're setting the globals to 1 to 300, and of course set them to the right resolution. And the first thing we want to do is bring in our tracked camera and check that everything works well. So you should have a camera track file. Let's import script. And the cam track script is the one you want to bring in. And the track for this shot was done by Marco De Huy. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. And he did a wonderful job on a pretty hard track here. And what we have is a bunch of locators, and they are attached to a scene. And here we have an axis for the camera, and as you can see, the axis is not animated, and it's at the origin, and the camera itself. And as we play through, you can see nothing happens, and this is because he originally did the track starting at frame 1001. So what we can do is simply time offset the camera. So let's do that. And of course, let's put in here 1000. Let's zoom out a little bit. We can see the camera doing the move, and you can already see how difficult this move is, because it's not only a 180 degrees pan, there's also a lot of horizontal movement and vertical. So not an easy track. In order to check the track, we want to see the locators over the plate, so we can simply put them over. And we might want to reduce this to about half, so they're kind of half transparent. And as you browse through the plate, you can see the locators sticking to either tracking markers or other features in here, or the corners on the tiles on the floor. And everything seems to be working fine, but let's take a closer look at what happens at the edges of the frame. So right here, you can see that each locator is basically, the center of the locator is at the corner of the tracking marker. That's how they were tracked. If you look at the ones toward the edge of the frame, you see that they kind of slide off. And they get better as they move into the frame. You see that one. And that's a sure sign that we're missing distortion here. Every lens has at least some amount of distortion. So of course, that's part of the job of the tracking guy is to calculate the distortion and add that to the equation. And Marco did that. But since he used a 3D equalizer, he used a specific set of plugins that was made for Nuke by the company that makes 3D equalizer. And for that, you'll need to go online to their website and download a bunch of plugins. So you should have that a link in your files, and let's just take a look at that. So when you go to that link, you'll get a bunch of stuff here to download, and what you really need is the lens distortion plugin kit. Don't do the same mistake as I did and download the one just below it, which is an older version and very confusing. This is very easy. You unzip it and you basically drop all those plugins into your plugins folder. And then back in Nuke, you basically need to go, as usual, to your all plugins, click on Update All, and then once you do that, you should see them in the L, all these LD plugins. These are the lens distortion plugins. So once you have them set up, you can just load that little distortion script that you have there. So let's just do that. Again, import script. And it's the distortion script. Bring it in and add it under the render. And what you see now happening is that it gets even worse. And that's, of course, because currently it's set to undistort, and we want to do the reverse. We want to distort our tracked markers to match the distortion on the plate. And now you can see these all kind of fitting exactly at the center like they should do, which shows us that now we've got a good distortion, a good track, and we're ready to go. Okay, so for us to start laying out the background, we need to do a few things. First, of course, we need to get rid of the green screen because we want to see the background behind her. And for this, we can do a very rough primate extraction as we did before. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add a keyer here, a primate as usual, my favorite, and scrub around her. And really what we want to do is quickly clean up the BG. Let's do just that. Really don't have to worry about detail. Let's clean up a little bit here. That little area over there. And as you can see, it's hitting a lot of areas that are not supposed to be extracted at all, but we'll take care of it in a moment. Of course, we can't get rid at this stage of any of the rigs and the tracking markers. That's for later. Let's take care of her. Yeah, and that should be enough. A little bit of noise there. Okay, that's good enough. So of course all the green is not going to help us when we want to set the color for the background. So we might as well do a little more than this and kill the spill. So let's bring our trusty kill spill. And let's pre-mold all this. And now we've got her without all the green spill. Obviously, what's going on here is way too much green spill going on this area and extraction. We don't care so much about the spill. What we do want to keep this without holes just so that we don't get confused. So basically, if we look at the original plate, that is half transparent or more than half transparent. So that will be a bit of a problem later on. For now, we want to kind of put a line right here where the wall goes, and everything, basically everything to the right of this line will be totally opaque at this point, and we can do it roughly. So all you need to do is just, I'm creating a rectangle, then Shift Z will make all the corners sharp, not Bezier. And basically you create a line, and now you just need to animate it until this part goes out of frame. Okay, so I got a roto here. As you can see, I didn't even do it for every frame. Just a quick dirty roto to kind of mask out this area so it's all opaque. And now we can simply add it to the prime mat. Just an over will do. So our mat now looks like this, which of course makes more sense. And now of course we want to switch the over here. Instead of putting our scene, 3D scene over the plate, we want to put our plate over the 3D scene. So now the 3D scene is becoming our background. Okay, so we did the first step. We can at this point turn off the locators. Really don't need them anymore. But because the green screen is kind of curved and we're missing the edge of the balcony, and we're missing any sense of like railing or something blocking the edge of the balcony, everything seems kind of like in the air. It's going to be a little bit hard to visualize the background of the city without seeing something a bit more straight and solid there. So at this stage, before we even go to Maya, we might want to construct something very simple in 3D Nuke, just to serve as a sort of indicator. We can later on actually export that into Maya to help us as a reference when we set up the real 3D scene in Maya. So we don't have a lot of 3D indication. We've got those locators. I mean, we can use them, but actually we've got better geo for that, because Marco, in order to get the track right, had to build a survey model based on the trackers and the information he had there in the scene and other still images. So we can use that survey geo, even though it's we can't use it as is, but we can use it as reference. So let's bring that in. So what we need is a read geo node, and we want to load the geo we got from Marco. And that's a simple OBJ. There's no animation or anything. And what you can see here is basically, based on the tracking markers, he built a floor. And it's great because the floor, as you can see, is at 0, which already helps us, because every car we're going to put there is going to match the elevation of the floor. And what you can see here is the 2 green screens on the side and the front, and some elements that represent the back wall. So let's connect this geo to our scene. We can turn off the locators now. This is a better reference. And let's put another scene here. And that would be for our nuke geo. And first, of course, we want to create a floor. So here's our car. They're very small, so let's change the uniform scale to, let's say, 1000. That's better. Let's rotate it to lie down, minus 90 on the X. And let's make it square, so scale for Y would be 2. And now we basically want to move it to align with the green screen, with the geo of the green screens. And basically we want it to kind of extend a little bit further than where the green screens on the balcony are. So maybe a little more, something like this. And on that we want to bring it a little more. Yeah, something like this. Let's connect this scene to our main scene so we can see everything. And now let's do those edges. And we don't want to create actually like detailed railings or everything like this. I'm thinking that the railing we'll create will have a sort of a solid base, concrete or, you know, stucco base. And on top of that, there will be the actual metal railing. So we might want to do something like that base, at least to give us some reference for an edge of balcony. So let's go ahead and add a cube there to our scene. And we might want to try and scale it up. Well, that's way too much. To say uniform scale 100. And we don't need all these subdivisions. We just need a simple cube. So this is it. Let's bring it roughly up to stand on the ground. And now we want to extend it. All the way to the balcony. And we probably want to make it narrower and not as tall. I mean, we at this point we're kind of estimating and guessing, and probably the best way to get a feel of how much we want to go, how big and how tall, would actually be to really look at it in the comp. So let's turn off the original geo for now, and let's put some texture in it. And usually I'm using checkerboard for this stuff. Just helps you see where things are going more easily. And oh, our over is still at half 50%. Let's make it full. And this is already looking pretty nice. So assuming this is the base of the railing, and on top of that we'll have the metal rails. When she gets closer to the edge of the balcony, that should go about here, below her shoulders, something like that. So the height feels good on that side. The thickness is not as important for now on. So we can go back to our model and simply duplicate this cube. Let's turn it around 90 degrees on the Y and simply bring it to the other edge to give us that other side of the railing. And now we can go back and look at the whole thing. Yeah, and this is starting to work. So now that we have a basic layout, we can bring in the panoramic image for the background. But a word of warning here, it's a huge image, it's 18K, and I've been having problems with Nuke crashing on when you bring it in the first time, and part of it is a memory, so you probably want to clear all your cache before you even bring it. It's always a good idea, and of course save everything. Bring it in. It's a TIFF file, and you can see that it's 18K. That's very big, so be careful with it. Give it some time and some love. Once you bring it in and it's working, it will probably hold on there. So this is of course a panoramic stitch, and it was actually shot by our very own John Montgomery in Mexico City. And it's a great panorama. I mean, we've got all the resolution, we've got all the detail there, very high definition, so that's great. But of course, there are many things that are not going to work just out of the box. First of all, if we look back at the plate, we can see immediately that the plate was and the panorama were probably shot at different times of the day, or maybe at different days. It's a different location, different camera, different exposure. So of course things are not just going to match magically. Besides that, if we really wanted to do it for real, we'll have to create a whole matte painting there with the whole foreground as 3D, or at least projected on cards, because as you remember when we looked at the camera, we don't just have a nodal pan, and actually cameras rarely do a nodal pan because they don't rotate on their nodal point. And once you have something that's more than a nodal pan and has some lateral movement, you will be expecting to see some parallax in the background, which we can't do with a single image. But looking again at the plate and realizing that there is a quick move around, and then we kind of settle on a certain angle and not move much beyond that, we can definitely go with what we have. It's a little bit of hacking, but it will work. So all these issues, the lighting, the color, the placement, I think it's a great opportunity to be in a situation that is very similar to what you encounter every day when you work in production. So sometimes we have this utopian notion that if you do everything technically correct in visual effects, everything will fall in place, and we just have to plug everything to the right place and it will work. And a lot of artists expect things to work like this, and then they encounter all kinds of problems that were not anticipated. And a good VFX artist is one that is able to sort of hack things around to make them look good. Because as I always say, at the end of the day, when the director looks at the stuff, he looks at the visuals. He's reacting to what he sees. He does not really care on how you did it and whether you did it technically accurate or not technically accurate. And again, I think the only part in visual effects that really has to be 100% technically accurate is camera tracking. Everything else is subjective and depends on your eye, your creativity, and your judgment. Okay, so let's now move on. So now we want to place this image on a cylinder, and I'm saying cylinder and not sphere, because really there's not going to be a lot of up and down movement in the camera. Most of it is turning around in a lateral movement, so I think we should be safe putting it on a cylinder, and that will make things easier for us. So let's create a cylinder here, and we can already put it on the cylinder just like that. It's tiny, so let's just change the radius to 50, and also the height to 50, and you can see the image there. Now we have way too much subdivision in here that we don't need. So the verticals, we don't need anything really. We can turn it just to 1, and we can reduce this as well, as long as we don't get too faceted. So 24 should be good. And now if you look at the projection, you can see that it got switched around because we're looking inwards. So that circular tower is now on the right side instead of the left. So really we want to just flop the image to work for us. So let's do that. Let's just add a transform and -1 on the width. And now that circular tower is at the right place. The other thing you're seeing is that we're stretching our panorama too much, and that's of course because in the cylinder it's currently, the U extend is set to 360 degrees, but this was never a 360 panorama. It's only about 180, and again we have to judge by our eyes. So let's do it 180, and that already makes more sense. Also, you've noticed that I made the radius and height similar, and that's a general rule you should always keep. If you do not want to distort your image, assuming it was shot correctly and stitched correctly, you want to keep these the same. And a good way to judge that is to look at something that's either square or circle. And we can look at right here, this banner on that building, and you see those circles. So if I change the height to say 70, you can immediately see that we're stretching everything. Similarly, if I'll change the radius to say 30, now we're squeezing everything. So as a general rule, keep these the same. Okay, so let's take our cylinder with the image and add it to our main scene. Like this. And of course it's tiny little one. At this point I think it's good to use a transform geo node, because we're going to play a lot with the position and rotation of the cylinder to work well for our shot. And it's usually a good idea, once you have good settings for your geo, to just use an additional node to transform it. So let's add a transform geo here. And first thing we want to do is, of course, make it much bigger than that. Let's multiply by 20. And now it's encompassing our whole scene, more or less. And again, we'll have to cheat on the distance, because in reality, things that are closer to the balcony are not going to be the same distance as the back. So we have to think of like a median distance, so to say. And that should work for our shot. Okay. Now maybe it's a good idea to actually see it in context of the shot. So this is towards the end where she's looking, and this is where we see the background after the fast move. And the question is, what do we want to see there? Based on that, we'll rotate the cylinder or our transform geo to put the area in the image that we want to see. And I think it would be nice to see a street right there. Let's try and rotate the Y. Let's see, let's do 40. And now we actually went the wrong direction. So we should go to the minus. Let's try 30. So you see the street here. I think it will be a good idea that she looks down the street and not this way. Let's try minus 70. And that's already looking better. Now you see a lot of this building that might look a bit ugly. If you want to see more of the street, we can push back a little bit. Let's try minus 60. But the thing that bothers me here, assuming we have a railing here, is that it almost feels like her balcony is rotated in the wrong direction. It should be kind of parallel to the street. So for now, let's keep it at minus 70. And now you can see it moving through the camera. And here's our railing that we created in Nuke. That's helping. Now there's another problem, disregarding the light and the color, which are now off. the perspective looks wrong. So it seems like we're looking way too much downwards. We should probably have the horizon lower down and see more sky. It just doesn't look right the way it looks right now, and you can see it throughout the shot. Feels like we're looking way too much downwards. So to change this, we basically need to bring the cylinder down. By how much? That's basically based on how it feels. Let's try and bring it down -50 on the Y, of course. This is already feeling better, but I still have this feeling that we're looking too much downwards. Let's try -100. Okay, this is starting to feel better. You see her height, you can feel the camera position, and as you look around, that kind of feels pretty good. Now again, this is a good example of where you really have to judge things by your eye. You don't have the measurements and the precision tools to define, and we're basically marrying two different things. We're marrying one shot with one camera somewhere to another background shot with a stills camera on a stitch. So really, at this point, it's pretty much up to you, your eyes, and your feel. Now, another thing that will define what part of the background we're exactly seeing and how it moves through the shot is the actual location of the cylinder and the X and Z in relation to the camera. And for this, we want to go back to our 3D scene, and we are seeing our camera right here doing its move. And again, that's a decision of where we want to place the cylinder right now. Let's look at our center and a transform geo. It's a little bit in front of the camera. We might want to look at it from the top. And again, that's a decision. Do you want to align it to the starting position of the camera, and then the camera is going to get closer to it that way? Or do you want to align it to the end position of the camera where we see most of the background? And I'm feeling that's what we want to do. And again, we have to look at it and see how it feels. So I'm moving the whole cylinder to about here. Something like this. So the camera starts a little at the back and then goes here. And this, as you can see, changes the position a little bit of the background, and I feel this is actually better. It's bigger now in frame. I see the railing here, kind of feels right. Let's look towards the move. Yeah, I think this is actually helping. Also makes this big building feel a little bit more aligned to the edge of the balcony. And again, here feels like our edge of the balcony is kind of parallel to that street, which kind of makes sense. So let's keep it this way. Now here's another thing we need to be aware of, and for this, yeah, let me just let's turn off our Nuke Geo for a second. And if you look at the edge of the frame right here, you see some weird stretching going on. Let's see if we see it on the other side. Yeah, you can see it here too. And this is because we are using a distortion node, which is distorting the image. And you'll see that if we turn off the distortion, everything falls back in place. But of course, we want to keep the distortion. And the way to solve this issue of stretching the edge of the frame is simply to overscan in our scanline renders. So overscan is set to 0. We want to have enough pixels there to cover this area, and that depends on our distortion. Let's try 30 pixels, and that kind of solves it. Let's try 20. We see a tiny little bit of it at the edge, so let's keep it at 30. So you want to set the minimum amount of pixels there, so because overscan is going to take a little bit more time because it's scanning a bit of a wider frame, but keep enough so that you get rid of the issue of stretching because of distortion. Now let's talk now about color and light. So quite obviously we can't really change the light on our background, and obviously we can't change it on our foreground. We're kind of tied to what it is, but right now it doesn't feel too bad in terms of light, because you can see that the light is coming from the top and a little bit from the right on her, generally, on the background here. So this is matching kind of the light that we see on the background. It is coming from that side. You can see on the poles too that the light is, I think on our plate it's coming a bit more from the top, but we can live with that as long as we get the colors to match, because right now there is a total mismatch, and it helps to look at the plate itself. It's very lifted, bright, kind of warmish, definitely not the kind of blue sky, contrasty, generally blue background that we have. And we can change it just by changing the color. Let's add a color node here. And I think the first thing we want to do is reduce the saturation. Now, reducing saturation only brings the values of the red, green, and blue closer together. It's not necessarily help you gonna get rid of the blue, but it will help us have a little bit less of that color range that we have now, which is too exaggerated for the plate. Let's change it to 0.8. And you see there's not a big difference, but we're getting a bit rid of that big range of colors. And as usual, I try to start with the big brush strokes on coloring and then do anything smaller. So I'm feeling like we should bring up the gamma to reduce the contrast in general. Let's do that. Let's put it at 1.2. Okay, that already feels much better, because and it almost feels like more hazy, which I think is the kind of feeling that we get from the plate. More hazy, less saturated, still feeling too blue and still feeling a bit too dark. So let's bring in the gain. We want to probably make everything brighter. We want to take out some blue. Something like this already feels better. So let's see. Let's make everything a bit. Let's put this at 1.6. The red. Well, that's now too red. Let's bring the green almost to the same level as the red. And now it's probably too green. Let's bring the blue to, let's say, 0.35. Not bad. 0.36. I think this is starting to feel much closer. As you can see, you can feel. Let's bring our little nuke stuff here just to cover that area that we're not supposed to see. If you look at her, you look at the background, now it feels more like we're in the same environment. We might want to, no, I don't think we want to go much brighter than this. If you look at the whites here, you look at the whites there, they are kind of blown up. Look at her shirt, kind of like here. And I wouldn't judge by this color, because as you remember, we did a quick dispel on everything, which we shouldn't really, because that made everything feel a bit too blue here. We'll tweak this later on to match better, but I'm looking more at her shirt and the white on her shirt, and that is starting to feel like this. And the color of the sky now feels much more like the kind of sky you'd want to see when you expose to her. I bet that if we could actually see sky in the original image, it will feel like this, blown up and white, and not blue and defined as it was before. So I think we are making good progress here. I think we might want to reduce the contrast even more. So we can do this by changing the contrast here. Let's put it to 0.9, and that gives that extra feeling of kind of haziness, which I think we really want to see in here. And we'll do more subtle color correction and some flaring to match the plate later on, but I think now we're in a much better position in terms of color and feel. So now that we've got a background pretty much set up, at least as a starting point, we probably want to render that background as a pre-comp, because you don't want to have all this 3D stuff going on here right now and slowing you down. When you render the background as a pre-comp, you might want to turn off your color correct, because you want to be able to do that post pre-comp on your rendered background. And now we're back. You see how weird it looks suddenly. This is the original color. So you want to turn this off. And then the last thing I want to talk about before you actually pre-comp this is motion blur, and whether you want to bake the motion blur into your pre-comped background or not, and which type of motion blur to use. So there are basically two ways to do motion blur on a 3D object in Nuke. The more accurate one would be, and let's just turn these off, because these are not, of course you don't want to render them with the background. These are just placeholders. And let's go to the area where she's moving fast, which is somewhere around here. The fast motion camera, not her, the camera, sorry. The more accurate one would be to do a real 3D motion blur, and for that you'll go to multi-sample and start raising those. And as you do that, you get a true 3D motion blur. Now I have samples at 3, which is too low, because you can see the motion blur feels almost like stepped. That looks horrible. So to get a true good looking motion blur, you might want to set this at least to like 10, and that gives you a much nicer gradation, more steps in between. And this is great. The only problem, basically two problems. One is that it slows down your render considerably, of course, and that's up to you to decide where you want to spend time in terms of rendering. But the other thing is that I'm not totally convinced that this motion blur is correct. I'm not saying Nuke is doing something wrong. I'm saying, again, because we're cheating the whole thing here. If I look at the actual plate as this frame, I don't see tons of motion blur. What I see is defocus, and you can very easily figure out if what the blur you're seeing is actually camera focus or motion blur, because motion blur tends to go to one side, you know, depending on the direction, and feel more like a doubling, as you can see here on our render. And here it feels pretty consistent. So for some reason we don't get that much amount of motion blur. So if we pre-comp and render out this using this method, we're pretty much tied to that. We can play with the shutter, but at least at this stage I'd rather do the fake 2D motion blur using motion vectors. So we can turn this back to 1 for now, and we just want to output a motion vector. And right now it's set to forward, which is good enough for us. We might want to change the classic to distance or velocity. The classic is the legacy old way of getting motion vectors. And of course now we need to add a filter, a vector blur. And we want our vector blur to basically receive the vectors through that channel, which was forward. And right away you can see we're getting tons of motion blur. It looks a bit similar. It's not that bad, similar to what we had with a true 3D. The good thing about using motion blur is that it's faster, and that you can keep on tweaking it in the comp as much as you want. You're not tied to something. And it's easy to tweak, just changing the multiply. So making it bigger will give us even more motion blur, which I think we definitely don't want. I'll put it back to 1, and putting it to 0.5 will give us a more reduced motion blur. So we always have control over that. So now that you have vector information in here, you can render it without any motion blur. And the only question is, how do you render your extra channel or layer in the same EXR? And that we'll do in the next class. We'll talk about multi-channel EXRs. And after we do that, we're gonna go back to the plate and start cleaning it up, because if we want to go further with this shot, we really have to start thinking of getting rid of all those rigs, those stands, and those tracking markers, because they're getting in our way to seeing things. So a lot of work in the next class, and I hope to see you all there. Bye bye.